Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
I was halfway through pinning the last strand of my sister Lila's veil when she leaned toward me with that sugary tone she uses right before she slips in the knife, whispering, "Don't even think about wearing white, you're hardly pure." It was a line meant to slice, rehearsed in her head, delivered like a victory lap, and for a second I felt the sting rise behind my ribs, the kind that makes you want to defend yourself, but instead something steadier took hold. The calm I learned to wear like second skin when chaos wanted me rattled. I didn't answer, didn't roll my eyes, didn't even let her see me flinch. I simply set down the bobby pins, excused myself with the kind of polite smile she couldn't read, and walked into the bathroom. 5 minutes later, I came back buttoned into my full dress uniform, ribbons lined up sharp, brass polished to a mirror. The room stopped breathing. Mom's hands fluttered uselessly at her pearls. Dad's face didn't change, but his eyes fixed on me, and Lila just stood there, mouth parted, veil slipping a little from her perfect hair. Brandon, her fiancé, tried too hard to recover the moment, clapping like a politician caught off script, saying, "Well, look at our hero," with a grin too wide and too false. Nobody laughed. The silence did the work for me, and for once, she couldn't spin it. I kept that silence working in my favor when I raised a glass later. I told a sweet little story about the summer Lila and I ran a lemonade stand, about how she bundled cookies with every cup and made a killing at 8 years old, about how that kind of hustle was exactly the trait that would make her a formidable partner in life. Everyone smiled, relaxed, thought I was handing her a compliment wrapped in nostalgia. Then I reminded them, ever so gently, that she also told the neighbors the lemonade was organic when it came straight from a powdered can. The laughter that followed was warm but edged, and Lila's face stiffened as she tried to laugh with them, stammering that we were just kids. I nodded, said, "Exactly," and let the words hang like a weight no one could quite shake off. It was a feather that carried a needle, soft to everyone else, but sharp enough to prick her. My first little act of revenge was complete, not cruel, not loud, just honest in a way she couldn't dodge. But it wasn't until later that night I realized something bigger was hiding behind the polished smile of her groom-to-be. I caught him leaning over the bar with the event coordinator, tossing around words that didn't belong in his mouth: veteran discount, family sponsor, coach gets me rates nobody else can touch, as if stringing jargon together could build legitimacy. I froze mid-step, listening carefully, every instinct in me recognizing the rhythm of a story that didn't quite add up. He waved his phone around, showing a message thread with someone labeled Coach M, claiming this mysterious man could secure deals no one else could. The coordinator's binder sat open with color-coded tabs, and her fingers lingered on yellow, never green, never red, just yellow, the color of uncertainty. Later, as Mom fussed with my collar pin, asking if I couldn't just wear the blue dress she'd bought, I thought about Brandon's casual confidence, the way he dropped supporting our troops into conversation like a charm bracelet he thought made him look noble. And then my phone buzzed with a picture a friend had forwarded, Brandon grinning at a golf fundraiser, holding an oversized check with the name of a so-called Veterans Foundation stamped across it. A logo that looked like it had been slapped together in Microsoft Paint. I clicked through the tags and found nothing but dead ends, broken links, and a trail that smelled like cheap cologne. That night, I lay awake in my old childhood room, ceiling fan rattling overhead just like it had when I was 14 and restless, and I thought about how Lila had always been obsessed with appearances, white dresses, perfect lighting, the illusion of purity, while Brandon seemed to have mastered the art of propping up illusions of his own. My sister had told me to stay out of her spotlight, but the truth was already leaking around the edges of her carefully curated world, and I knew it was only a matter of time before those cracks widened. The question wasn't whether I would step in, it was how I could do it without becoming the villain in the story she wanted everyone to believe. I rolled over, staring at the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, and thought about white paint on concrete, bright until rain hits, and then you see every flaw underneath. I didn't plan to blow anything up, not yet. I planned to move carefully, to push where the lies were weakest, to let the truth come out on its own. Tomorrow, I would make a call. Not to stir drama, not to start a fight, but to quietly verify the details of a discount that didn't exist. Sometimes revenge isn't loud, sometimes it's just paperwork, cold and unshakable. And as I finally drifted off, the echo of Lila's words replayed in my mind, that sneer about purity, and I almost laughed because while she worried about fabric, I was holding proof, real proof, that purity had nothing to do with white lace or wedding vows. Morning came with coffee that could sand a plank, a legal pad stolen from Dad's desk, and the kind of focus that used to kick in when the brief said, "You will have one try at this," because sometimes the simplest plan is the one that doesn't rattle the cage. It just removes the bottom rung and lets the boasting fall under its own weight. I called the venue office, asked for the coordinator by name as if we had already been swapping spreadsheets for weeks, and explained that I was the point of contact for vendor logistics because the bride's brain was currently a glitter blizzard, which earned a sympathetic noise and a willingness to educate me about policy, and when I asked, in the politest tone I own, whether a veteran discount applied to family sponsors or only to contracts signed by the actual service member or a properly registered nonprofit with an active status, she paused just long enough to tell me she was reading the rule while we spoke, then said it was the latter, only the latter, and never the vague middle Brandon loved to occupy. I asked her to email the policy so I could help the groom file correctly, which she did within minutes, and then, as if we were coworkers on the same side of a small problem, I asked whether the invoice would update if proof was not submitted by end of day. She sighed the sigh of a competent woman holding a wobbly situation together and said accounting would revert to standard rates automatically, which meant someone would have to explain the missing pretzel bar money to the person who wanted to curate even the color of napkins to match the sun at golden hour. Brandon called while the policy was still sliding into my inbox, cheerful in that too loud way, telling me there had been a minor snafu and that Coach was already working angles I wouldn't understand. Which is adorable coming from a man who uses buzzwords like seasoning because he thinks they hide the taste of undercooked meat. I asked, gently, whether Coach had a last name or an organization with an employer identification number, and he took it as a joke, laughed for too long. Then pivoted into the usual small talk about my service, as if I were required to hand over a war story to pay for asking a question. I gave him the most boring anecdote I could think of about inventory and tracking, which made his attention slip like water off wax, and he ended the call with a breezy promise that turned into a threat the second it met a real policy. By lunchtime, the updated invoice arrived with standard rates, dry and clean and final, and I forwarded it into our family thread with a note that the venue simply needed formal proof if a discount applied. Mom responded with 3 anxious sentences about budgets and contingency envelopes. Dad replied with a thumbs-up emoji he still types out as a word, and Lila texted me privately asking whether I had poked at something that didn't need poking, as if the presence of a lie were less offensive than the inconvenience of removing it. I told her calmly that nothing had been poked. We had just reached the part where truth requires receipts, and she said I always turned simple things into principles, which might be the truest criticism she has ever lobbed at me. At the tasting that afternoon, he performed for the mothers, talking about leadership and sacrifice like he owned stock in both words, and when he raised his glass to our troops, he glanced at me in that sleazy way. The way a man checks whether his charm is hitting its mark, and I watched the coordinator across the room slide a printed invoice into a folder with a yellow tab and swipe the folder shut with the clean motion of someone who has no time left for drama. Brandon's jaw tightened just a fraction when she walked past him without stopping, but he recovered quickly, slinging an arm around Lila and telling the photographer that their story was classic, that they were built for the long game, and that the wedding would be the kickoff to a lifetime of giving back, which might have sounded noble if the words hadn't skittered around like beetles avoiding a flashlight. Revenge, in this round, was simple math disguised as housekeeping. The venue would not honor the imaginary category he stood on. The bill corrected itself, and all I had to do was watch the budget shed its glitter and showbone. Lila spent an hour in a private storm over whether to cut the photo booth or the late-night pretzel bar, and when she finally chose to keep the food because guests remember snacks more than snapshots, Brandon tried to turn it into gallantry, claiming he would find another discount before the rehearsal. I smiled and told him I had already CC'd myself on the accounting thread so I could help, which was as close as I could get to saying your magic trick only works on people who refuse to read the instructions card. Back at the house, Mom dabbed at her eyes over a stack of place cards, murmuring that she just wanted harmony. Dad retreated to the garage to check a squeak, and Lila appeared at my door with the shaky smile of a woman who wants a favor without admitting it, asking whether I could maybe wear the blue dress for the rehearsal so we don't make a thing out of it, and I told her the uniform was not a thing, it was my formal wear, but if she wanted less heat I could wear it and keep my mouth shut, which made her hug me with more relief than affection. As she left, my phone buzzed with a message from Jenna, who works nights at the hospital and knows how to read a donor list like a map. She wrote that the name from that golf fundraiser did not match any registered partner on the Veteran Services side. Maybe it existed under something else, but the logo screamed a printer jam. I thanked her and told her not to dig further without a formal request, because lines matter even when nobody is watching, and I prefer my revenge to pass an audit. After dinner, a new text arrived from an unknown number calling me Sergeant and advising me to stop interfering with private agreements, which made me laugh out loud because only a fool thinks a whisper in the dark can scare a woman who has already learned how to live with silence. I took a screenshot, saved the number under a nickname I will never repeat in church, and then opened the venue policy one more time, reading it like a bedtime story, soothing in its clarity. The invoice was fixed, the discount dead, the cushion gone, and the first wobble had become visible even to people who refused to look straight at it. The rehearsal dinner would be tomorrow, which meant microphones and toasts and the kind of performance Brandon believes is oxygen, and while Lila thought the uniform was the loudest statement I could make, I had a quieter move lined up. A practical kindness with teeth that would look, to every guest, like pure support. I had called a mobile notary, scheduled for a friendly drop-by under the pretense of saving time on signatures, and tucked into my purse was a slim honesty writer, a light little addendum written in soft language about assets, debts, and reputational claims. Nothing scary, nothing accusatory, just a request that both parties swear the story they tell about themselves is correct to the best of their knowledge, with penalties if it later proved to be not so. And while the dress code for that appointment would be civility, I planned to pair it with the uniform again, not as armor this time but as a mirror, because some men can dodge questions from family. But they have a harder time lying in front of a witness with a seal. The rehearsal dinner came wrapped in fairy lights and carefully staged candids, the kind of evening where even the napkin folds were coached to look casual, and as guests drifted in with gift bags and compliments rehearsed in the car, I felt that familiar steadiness settle like a level line across the top of my vision, the one that separates noise from signal and tells you where to place the next quiet step. Lila looked ethereal in a slip dress the color of champagne foam, her smile bright and brittle, while Brandon performed hospitality like a sport, greeting every cousin by name and ladling charm as if he had a bottomless pot of it on a back burner. The mobile notary texted that she was 5 minutes out. I smoothed my uniform, checked the slim envelope with the honesty writer, and walked over to Lila with an expression I knew she would read as supportive, because I needed her to lean into this, not fight it. I told her I had arranged a tiny convenience to save her an hour tomorrow. That as maid of honor I could handle the boring parts, that all she had to do was smile and sign, and her shoulders dropped the way they do when the world feels slightly less heavy. When the notary arrived, I introduced her to the couple with the practiced warmth of someone who has shepherded fragile things through bureaucracy, and we guided them to the side room usually reserved for dessert plating, where the chef had graciously surrendered a stainless steel prep table to our stack of papers. The prenup, which Lila had described as just a formality because Brandon's consultant insisted, sat in a stylish folder with a brand logo embossed in muted gold, and I watched Brandon's face change from confident to cautious as the notary flipped to the signature page, then paused, as I had asked, to present the one-page truth affirmation addendum, which in the softest legal language simply asked both parties to certify that all material representations made to each other and to vendors in connection with the wedding were accurate to the best of their knowledge, and that any misleading claims with financial implications would be corrected before the ceremony or the contract would be considered voidable. I had lifted the structure from a template meant for real estate disclosures and sanded off the sharp edges until it read like good manners. Brandon skimmed, swallowed, said it was overkill, then joked that if we had to add disclosures, maybe he should confess to addiction to iced lattes, which would have landed better if the notary hadn't been already stamping the seal onto the original prenup with the cool economy of someone who knows exactly which parts of a story are binding. Lila, for all her love of presentation, has always trusted a tidy process, and seeing the official stamp calmed her. She signed the addendum without fanfare, as if checking a well-labeled box. Brandon hesitated, glanced at me, and made the kind of light pun men make when they want to float away from a decision, but the notary's pen waited, steady and uncute. He signed. The seal pressed down. Revenge number 3 looked like a kindness and landed like a tripwire you don't notice until your ankle tugs. Back in the main room, the speeches started, Dad delivering a short and unexpectedly grounded toast about building rather than buying a life, Mom offering a fluttering wish for harmony, the bridesmaids trading gentle roasts that sounded like friendship bracelets, all while Brandon kept threading his resume into anecdotes, mentioning a corporate mentorship program and a veterans partnership he helped launch, which made the back of my neck itch, because people who help launch things usually know the exact names of the rockets. I let him talk and turned my own toast into a game I called The Almost Truth, which I framed as a way to celebrate growth, inviting everyone to share one tiny myth they once told about themselves and the truer sentence they live by now. Just a round of honesty dressed as party icebreaker. The room warmed to it. People confessed to calling hobbies passions, and then actually doing the work to earn the word, to bragging about promotions that were just new title stickers, to curating their feeds until even they didn't recognize their own Tuesday mornings. Lila laughed, admitted she once pretended to love hiking because Brandon did and now secretly preferred indoor plants with names, and the guests applauded the harmless vulnerability like it were entertainment. When it was Brandon's turn, he leaned into the bit and said he used to call himself a founder when he was really consulting, then added that he had stood up a foundation with friends to channel donations to veterans, which got an approving murmur from the aunts. I smiled and asked, in the same playful tone, what the foundation was called so we could tag it in tomorrow's vendor shoutouts, because donations usually enjoy daylight, and his eyes clicked to me, then to Lila, then back, as he mumbled a name I had not heard before. A slight variation on the one in that golf photo, the kind of swap you make when you hope no one is writing it down. I was writing it down. I repeated the name as if verifying spelling, thanked him, and lifted my glass. The game moved on. During dessert, I slipped Lila a gift, a shadow box lined with soft linen, holding a folded scrap of the white dress I once ruined working a midnight shift when a fuel line burst and everything smelled like burned metal for a week, next to a polished brass button and a tiny card that read, "Purity is a promise kept when nobody is watching." She stared at it, then at me, and for a second the room fell away, and I saw the kid who once stole the last orange popsicle and left me the grape, who cried because she hated grape too and didn't know how to fix it. She whispered that I was making this harder than it needed to be, that she just wanted a beautiful day, that none of this had to be a crusade, and I told her that beauty without truth is a costume that itches by midnight, and she pulled back like I had slapped her with a scripture. We were interrupted by my phone buzzing with a voicemail notification from an unfamiliar number, a clipped message from a hospital administrator about confirming whether our family's donation conduit should be listed under a different name on their recognition wall, which would be a lovely problem to have if anyone in our family had ever funded a recognition wall. I excused myself to the hallway and played it twice, slower the second time, catching the phrase fundraiser liaison tied to Brandon's email domain and a polite request for tax documentation. I saved it, forwarded nothing, and stood there watching my reflection in the dark window glass, the uniform making me look like I had answers I did not yet own. When I returned to the room, the DJ had slid into a favorite from our childhood. Lila was dancing with Mom, Brandon was cornered by a cousin with questions about investments, and the notary texted to confirm the sealed copies were in my bag. The evening could have ended there, with everyone full and happy and only the gentlest draft of doubt moving through the doorframes, but as I reached for my coat, a bridesmaid handed me her phone and asked if the man in the video, shot 2 Fridays ago at a rooftop bar, looked like Brandon, because if it was a lookalike it was uncanny, down to the hand on the small of a woman's back that was not Lila's. I watched 10 seconds without sound, just the grain of neon and the comfortable tilt of 2 bodies that had practiced being that close, then handed the phone back and said we should all remember that videos lie and timing is everything, which felt like the safest true sentence in the room. I left the party without making a scene, carrying the sealed prenup, the addendum, and the shadow box Lila had forgotten on a chair, and as I stepped into the cool night air, the voicemail replayed in my head against the image of Brandon's hand in that video. And I knew the next move would require both gloves, the soft one that comforts and the hard one that knocks. By morning the city felt like it had cleared its throat, the sky rinsed clean after a night of thin rain, and I walked into the day with a plan that would look, to anyone not paying close attention, like kindness stacked on professionalism, even though every step had teeth hidden under velvet. I started with a call to the venue to confirm delivery windows and microphone checks, folded in a polite request that vendor acknowledgments be read aloud before the dessert course, purely to thank the partners who made the night possible, I said. Because gratitude photographs well, and I asked that the master of ceremonies invite Brandon to share the name of the Veterans Foundation he had helped launch, so guests could donate in lieu of favors. The coordinator, a woman after my own heart, said she admired a couple who turned parties into purpose. I agreed and hung up, then forwarded the hospital administrator's voicemail to Lila with a cheerful note that the recognition wall needed the correct spelling for the foundation's name, and that Brandon could supply it when he did his speech. She wrote back a string of thank yous and a single question mark I chose not to interpret out loud. Next, I texted Chaplain Ruiz, who had taught me the difference between sermon and shelter when I was 20 and trying to learn how to be brave without becoming mean. He was in town for a conference and had already promised to say a brief blessing at the rehearsal dinner if the schedule allowed. I asked whether he could make it a shade more specific, something about vows depending on truth, charity beginning with honesty. The kind of language that sounds like poetry until the person who has been bluffing recognizes the mirror. He replied with a simple, "Consider it done," which is the closest thing to a prayer I trust. At the salon, while Lila's hair became an architectural project, I perched with my legal pad and made a list that had nothing to do with flowers or seating. The addendum safely sealed with the prenup in my bag, the notary on standby in case anyone decided. We didn't mean it like that. The hospital's request waiting for a document Brandon might not be able to produce, the video of the rooftop bar saved to a bridesmaid's phone, and Dad's unexpected toast from last night, attention to building. Not buying, still humming in my ears like a tuning fork. Lila watched me in the mirror the way people stare at storms on the horizon, trying to decide whether the clouds will slide past or park overhead. She said she wished I could have let the uniform be enough, that the moment in the suite had already made its point, that I didn't have to push, and I told her I wished the world rewarded gentleness without receipts. But that, in my experience, the only thing that changes a story built on a pretty lie is the moment the microphone asks for a date, a name, and a number. She called me dramatic. I let it pass. By late afternoon, the rehearsal hall glowed like the inside of a seashell, the kind of light that forgives nearly everything, and as guests settled into their places, the coordinator handed me the final vendor thank you script with an extra line where Brandon would be invited to share the foundation's full name for our donation wall and provide the tax identification to accounting after dinner, which read like confetti until you saw the words that mattered. The blessing came first, Ruiz warm and spare, speaking about vows as promises made in the quiet, about reputations built slower than parties, about love choosing the hard truth over the pretty story. And I felt Lila stiffen beside me because she heard the note beneath the music and did not like being the instrument. Then came toasts. The cousins were funny, Mom fluttered, Dad kept it short and steady, and the master of ceremonies, with professional cheer, turned to Brandon for his remarks. He loved the stage, and he stepped into it like a man who recognizes his reflection. He thanked families, praised Lila's pure heart, glanced at me as if to reclaim the word, and launched into a polished paragraph about service and giving back, about partnering with a nonprofit he and a small group of friends had formed, designed to funnel corporate generosity to veterans in need. He landed the line and beamed at the applause, at which point the MC, hitting the mark we had arranged, asked for the foundation's full legal name so guests could tag it tonight and tomorrow, and Brandon said it clearly, confidently. A name that did not match the one on the golf photo or the hospital voicemail, then added that formal documents were in progress, the phrase people use when paperwork is a mood board. The coordinator stepped forward with a crisp thank you and, with the care of a nurse changing a dressing, reminded him that vendor recognition required an identification number on file by the end of the evening. She said it warmly, as if offering him extra bread. He laughed too hard, promised to email it within the hour, and I felt the air thin a notch as 3 separate truths landed at once. The hospital would now have a name to compare against nothing. The addendum's clause about misleading claims with financial implications had just attached itself to an actual sentence said into a microphone, and the MC's request, captured cleanly on video by the venue's standard recording package, had become a time-stamped fact. Revenge number 4 looked like applause and felt like a ledger balancing itself. After dinner, I took Lila to the coat room, the only quiet pocket left, and handed her the sealed envelope from the notary and the shadow box she had forgotten the night before. I told her that if tomorrow brought anything she had not ordered off the menu, she could open the envelope and decide for herself, that I was not here to force a scene, that I would stand where she needed me to stand, in blue dress or uniform, silent or speaking, as long as she understood the difference between a mistake and a pattern. She asked whether there was a video. I said there was a lot of video in the world. She asked whether I was trying to save her or punish her. I told her I was trying to keep the room honest enough that she could hear her own voice when it counted, and she blinked hard and said I always make everything heavier than it needs to be. On our way back in, my phone chimed with an email from the hospital administrator, polite to the point of painful, thanking Mr. Hale for his earlier outreach and asking whether the foundation he'd named tonight was connected to the previous fundraiser's entity or whether they should list the gift as anonymous until documentation arrived. I did not answer. I watched Brandon cross the room toward us, smile surgically intact, and wave his phone like a magic wand, saying he had just texted Coach and everything would be handled. Lila pasted on a smile that did not reach her eyes, and in that narrow second between movement and decision, the MC announced that the venue would play a brief compilation of photos and clips from the couple's story so far. A sweet package set to the song Lila had chosen months ago, and the screen lit up with beach sunsets and brunch plates and a rooftop shot from 2 Fridays ago where the grain softened faces into romance, which would have meant nothing at all if the camera angle hadn't also captured, at the edge of the frame, a reflection in the bar's window, Brandon's hand at the small of a woman's back, a woman who was not the bride, a detail you could miss if you didn't know what to look for. The room side at the montage, I felt Lila's fingernails trace small crescent moons into her palm. The clip ended to warm applause, the lights rose, and Brandon leaned to kiss Lila's temple as if choreography could erase physics, while across the room the coordinator caught my eye and tapped the side of her folder, 1 finger, 2 taps. Her quiet way of telling me that accounting had not received anything at all. Morning broke with that hard, glassy brightness that makes everything look cleaner than it is, and I stood at the mirror fastening the last button of my dress uniform with the same patience I used to secure a loose truth, telling myself that whatever happened at the altar would not be a spectacle if I could help it, that the goal was not to torch the room but to open a window wide enough for air to rush in, that a wedding can survive a draft but not a vacuum. The house operated like a beehive, hairspray floating in lights, steamers hissing, ants corralling corsages, and through it all Lila moving like someone who has rehearsed joy so thoroughly she believes she can force it into being by hitting her marks. while Brandon texted from the groom's suite that parking was chaos, a message that somehow managed to be both trivial and evasive at the same time. I slipped the sealed notary envelope into my bag alongside a small brass key to a storage locker I had rented that morning, a quiet metal promise that evidence is kinder when given a home, and I walked out the door telling Mom I would meet them at the venue with the bouquet ribbons she kept forgetting to remember. The chapel was the color of pale honey and smelled faintly of eucalyptus, tasteful and photogenic, which is to say built for stories, and as guests settled into pews and phones silenced themselves into obedience, I checked with the coordinator about the order of service one last time, confirmed that vendor acknowledgments would come after the vows, that the donation link would be projected only if an identification number materialized, and that the audio crew had a clean feed, because there are days when the difference between rumor and history is whether a microphone was on. I found Lila in the anteroom staring at herself without blinking, and I told her she looked like herself, not like a magazine, which was the highest compliment I knew how to give. She touched my sleeve, then my ribbons, then the shadow box I had repacked into her bag, and she asked in a voice too small for the dress whether I would stop the ceremony if I had to, and I said I would only ever ask for a pause, that pauses are not the same as endings, that breath is not betrayal. She nodded and then shook her head and finally whispered that if she stumbled she wanted to fall toward me, not away, and I said I would be there either way. The processional began, a soft tidal swell of strings under a tiny storm of sniffles, and when it was time I walked the aisle at an even pace, eyes open and hands steady, a moving mirror. Some people saluted with a glance and some avoided outright. And then Lila appeared on Dad's arm looking like a promise the world had made to itself, and Brandon waited at the front with the posture of a man who thinks the moment is his to command, which is a misunderstanding older than most cathedrals. The officiant opened with a few lines about covenant and community, words that belong in rooms like this, and the vows came next, Lila first, simple and specific, full of small domestic hopes that are hard to fake, and then Brandon, whose version leaned on grand statements about legacy and impact, phrases that travel well and land nowhere, and when he reached the part about building on our shared commitment to service, the chapel's quiet shifted in that microscopic way living rooms do when someone says the thing everyone agreed not to say. I did not interrupt. I let him finish. I let the blessing wash over the room like a cool hand. I let the officiant reach the question that makes a ceremony real, and then I stepped forward, not into the aisle but to the side, holding the envelope and the key like props in a play only one of us had read, and I asked, in a voice that carried because it was not loud, whether I could request a brief, respectful pause for clarity on a contractual matter that affected the couple's obligations as of this morning, and because I wore a uniform and a face that belonged to a woman who does not ask lightly, the officiant blinked, glanced at Lila, and then nodded. I handed Lila the envelope and told her inside was the notarized addendum she had already signed and the printout of the hospital's email requesting documentation for the foundation Brandon had named. And I turned to Brandon and said that the venue had not received the identification number promised last night, that the donation link stood ready but blank, and that the addendum she trusted included language about correcting any misleading statements with financial implications before the ceremony. And I asked whether he wished to provide the number now or to proceed with the promises as a matter of personal conscience rather than public posture. For a heartbeat he smiled with that well-oiled warmth that had carried him this far, the grin that had smoothed over minor collisions and lubricated larger ones. But then he realized that the only road forward was a fact, not a feeling. And he reached for his phone as if the answers lived there like obedient birds, and he scrolled and finally said that the number would be available after the weekend when Coach returned from a retreat, which is an answer for brunch, not for vows. The room did not gasp, it exhaled, and someone in the back coughed the kind of cough that bluntly announces the presence of oxygen. Lila stared at him with a face I recognized from childhood when the magician did the trick slower and she saw the cards slide up the sleeve, and I saw the one calculation you can never do for someone else begin inside her, the math of what you can live with. I offered the quietest revenge I have ever engineered, a path that did not punish so much as require gravity. I told the officiant I would step outside with Brandon if he preferred to make a private call to his accountant and return with the document. That there was no need for humiliation or drama, that we had all the time in the world measured in minutes that felt like more, and without waiting for an answer I handed Brandon the brass key and said it opened a locker at the transit station, where copies of the golf photo, the voicemail transcript, and the rooftop video sat in a plain folder with his name, that they were his to review and correct if he believed them inaccurate, that the choice to share them rested with him, not me, and that I would honor the decision either way as long as the vows that followed were true. He took the key like it was heavier than metal, and for a second his shoulders softened as if he might actually walk out and dial an honest number, but old habits reached for air, and he slipped the key into his pocket and said he would clarify everything later, that we were making meaning where mere logistics lived, that love was bigger than paperwork, which is a beautiful sentence that sometimes hides a swamp. What happened next will sound like a cliffhanger because it felt like standing at the lip of one. Lila lifted her bouquet, nodded once to the officiant, and asked for 10 minutes alone in the side chapel, which emptied of flowers and photographs and left only 2 chairs and a window that threw a square of stunned light on the floor, and I stood guard outside the door with my hands clasped and my heart doing old drills, while inside, she made a choice I will not translate for her. When she emerged, her face was calmer than it had been in months, and she took her place again with that lifted chin she learned from Mom and that set jaw she borrowed from Dad, and the officiant asked, one last time, whether we were ready. And she said yes in a voice that contained both goodbye and hello, and whatever she meant by it is the part of this story I intend to leave alone because it belongs to her. After the reception that followed, or did not, depending on how you decide to end this in your mind, I walked out into the early evening carrying the shadow box and a folded program and the small ache that arrives when a fire is averted or lit. And my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that simply read, understood, which could have been surrender or threat or something in between, and I turned the screen face down and kept walking, thinking about purity and white and uniforms and promises, about how silence can speak in one room like a trumpet and in another like a prayer, and about how justice sometimes looks like an open door that someone else must choose to walk through. Whether I saved my sister or punished a man, I cannot tell you with certainty without telling you more than you have a right to, and maybe that is the point I was always moving toward, that the most honest revenge is to build a mirror and step out of the frame, leaving the person who wanted a perfect picture to decide whether to keep posing or to finally face the light.